So welcome to This Cycling Life, Tech Bites. Today I'm speaking with Professor Josh Miller. My name is Jamie Anderson. I'm an academic, an author, and of course a cyclist. I'll be the co-host today. Josh, would you like to introduce yourself briefly?
Thanks, Professor Jamie. I'm Josh Miller. I am a clinical associate professor at the University of Illinois in Chicago in the United States. So hope to see everybody soon.
Excellent, good. So Josh, we've got to get you over here to Belgium. As everyone knows, I'm Australian, I live in Belgium, but the real cycling, it happens here. So hopefully when this COVID-19 thing's behind us, you can come over and we can do some of those small climbs in the Flemish Ardennes together. But we're not here today to talk about cycling in Belgium. We're here actually to talk about a concept that is super important for any level of cyclist, and that is overtraining. So we're going to spend about 20 minutes talking you through the principles of initially of training, how that works in terms of overreach or overload, and how sometimes for some of us that can even result in a syndrome which is called overtraining, which is something that is actually inhibits our performance rather than helps us. So that's what we're going to talk about. We've actually got a few slides. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump over to our slide pack. And what we're going to do is we're going to talk through initially some of the fundamentals of training. So Professor Josh, would you like to talk to us a little bit about training and how this concept of progressive supercompensation or overload works when we do it right?
Sure, Professor Jamie. So if we look at the slide right here, what we're looking at is the basis of how we evolve in training, if you want to think about it that way. Whenever we start exercising, what we find is that our body ends up accumulating some amount of fatigue. And that's where we see this reduction in our training response. You can kind of see by this figure that the line of reduced capacity is going down. And then if you remember from our last talk, we talked about recovery. And that's where those recovery techniques come into play, whether it's cold water immersion, nutrition, rest, sleep, compression, whatever you're doing to take that time off the bike, it allows you to recover, regenerate. Sleep is really important for that and allows us to basically kind of get back to our initial fitness level. But when we talk about supercompensation, we're talking about increasing our capacity above that initial fitness level. So when we talk about training, we're thinking about increasing our fitness so that when we go out for a bike ride, we can actually get better each time. We can ride up that hill faster. We can sprint a little bit longer. We can actually maintain the same power output at a reduction of our intensity that we need to exercise that. And that's where supercompensation comes into play.
And I guess a lot of people are familiar with a curve, something like this, because people are using Training Peaks or they're using Strava. And on in a platform like Strava, we talk about fitness, we talk about fatigue, and we talk about form. So can you talk to us a little bit about that? Because clearly there's the fatigue factor that you're building up during this process of overload that increases fitness over time. Where does the form come in here?
When we think about form, we're actually thinking about that recovery coming into play. So that training is helping us mature or get better at what we're doing, becoming more efficient. We're able to utilize more oxygen. We can build a little bit more pathways to the muscle so we can bring more oxygen to it so we can utilize it. And that's where we're actually seeing the change in fitness comes into play. If you want to really think about it, this slide was actually created back in roughly about 1918, 1919 by Hans Selye, who used to look at overload in patients. He was a medical physician who actually looked at, I believe it was the kidneys, looking at cortisol function. So it helped to look at what's going on in the system. And that's actually how we came about with this slide and helps us to look at how people are training and if there is an overload response to them.
Yeah. So I guess what we're talking about here as well is that we need to really think about training in terms of these cycles. That there is periods where we do periods of intense bouts of activity, and then we need to allow our body to recover. Because I guess one of the things that I see with a lot of masters athletes, I follow a bunch of people on Strava, is for me, sometimes I don't see a lot of variation in their training. I see that they're doing almost the same thing week in, week out. And a lot of that, say, might be kind of tempo kilometers or steady kind of riding. What's going on there? What happens there if you're not actually really pushing your body further? You're just continually at that sort of level of continuity?
What we're trying to do is over time, we are trying to increase our fitness, but there is going to be a time and period that we do need to basically maintain where we're at. We're not going to go out every day. We're not going to try and win the Tour de France on the first day. It's going to be a cumulative approach.
Mhm.
And what we're looking to do is basically build up those systems, build those enzymes, build the muscle fibers, increase the ability to bring more oxygen to the muscle, so having more capillaries being made. And that's actually what's kind of being going on during those time periods.
Yeah.
But we remember, we are masters athletes, and we do need a little extra time off in between our rides because we are a little bit more susceptible to this downward reduced capacity a little bit more frequently than, say, those younger athletes.
Yeah. Okay. Good point. And actually, that sort of brings us on to our next slide because, at the moment, of course, I'm training, but I had quite a big build up for some early season racing. So I was racing the UCI World Series Gran Fondo in Casablanca in February. Then I was planning to have a big month in March and April. That didn't happen, of course, because of coronavirus. But actually, sort of what I'm doing right now is maintenance work. So I'm not doing loads of kilometers or loads of high intensity training. I'm sort of in that plateau phase. And what my coach has talked to me about is this actually is very important to avoid overtraining later on. And we'll come and talk about this because, of course, overtraining is not just physical, it can also be mental. So when you look at this chart, Josh, I mean, what do you see there and what do you believe there for masters athletes? How important is it at times just to hold this plateau and not to be doing that high intensity stuff?
Right. Looking at this graph, what we're going to find is that no matter what, it kind of starts out in a detraining phase. And if you want to think what detraining is, that's going to be like when we take time off for the bike. You're going to find that some athletes might take a month off, might take a couple of weeks off just to recover, especially if they came from a big race. And then we kind of see that the training load does start to increase as well as their fitness level. But if there's no true goal, let's say, like you said, you had some Gran Fondo races that you wanted to compete in March, but unfortunately that was canceled. That maintenance load allows you to basically get on the bike, spin your legs, maintain those physiological functions that you've created that we've just briefly talked about before, but it doesn't allow you to build up so much fatigue that in a sense it puts you in a downward spiral. Because remember, we're going to train very specific at those times that we're ready for competition.
Okay, good. Well, that brings us on to our main topic of today, of course, which is overtraining. So we've got another graph to share with people. So talk to us about this one, Professor Josh. I mean, this is kind of called the downward spiral of overtraining. Can we perhaps talk first of all about what might bring on, overtraining, and then how do we actually feel it or see it? How does it manifest itself?
Sure. So thanks a lot, Professor Jamie. I always try to remember to say thank you. But if you think about it, if we look at this graph, think about what's going on. When we train, what are we causing to occur? We are causing some fatigue, whether we're just getting out on the bike and spinning our legs real easy, or we're on the indoor trainer, we're just spinning away. There is an accumulation of fatigue. And as you can see from this graph, what you see is a person goes out, trains for a day, trains for a week, whatever, and there's a buildup of fatigue that's accumulating. But they're not allowing the body to recover enough. They're not eating well. Maybe, think about the typical college student. What do they live on? A lot of times here in the United States, it's fast food, whatever they can get their hands on fast enough. But they're not getting those proper nutrients back into their system. They're not sleeping enough. Definitely, these are things that we want to occur. And then we're continuing to train further and further, and we're waking up sore, stiff. We get out of bed, we're just not feeling right. And it builds up over time, and then it actually causes this continuous, I don't want to say disdain, but you decide maybe not to get on the bike. And kind of that we're seeing is that we're not getting back to what we were able to do. Mm-hmm. So depending upon, let's say, what a person's FTP is, maybe it's 200 watts. They get on the bike and they just go for a spin at 200 watts, but they can't maintain it. Yeah. Their heart rate response doesn't get there. These are all signs and symptoms that we might see. But think about
it's interesting what you say there. I mean, I had a friend of mine here in Belgium last year who I was giving some coaching support to, a guy called Lander, and he went off and did some really heavy racing in sort of late March, April. He had some great results. He raced the UCI Gran Fondo series in Cyprus. And then after that race, he told me he was going off to Gran Canaria for a 10-day training block. And I said, Lander, that's perhaps not a good idea. You've just built up to a really heavy period of racing. And his plan was to go on and do more racing in June. He actually did that 10-day training block. And what we saw was exactly what you're talking about here. He came back from that block, and rather than his numbers having improved, they were significantly worse, actually. And not only were they worse just in the month afterwards, that continued for about 3 months. So what's going on there, Josh? Where sometimes you do push your body perhaps beyond its limits, or this fatigue accrues. But why was he still seeing that maybe 8 weeks, 10 weeks after that period where he did really overextend himself?
Sure. So think about the training. We talked about it. We talked about initially that there's an acute bout, but there's a accumulating effect of it. So first we get into this overreaching. It's not like you're overreaching to reach something up on the top shelf. It's overreaching in the sense that you're accumulating a little bit more fatigue than you should be. And that's going to be more of a functional overreaching. It kind of transitions into a next phase, which would be a non-functional overreaching, where now we're definitely building up more reduction in capacity. We're building up more fatigue. We're starting to see maybe some more signs and symptoms. And if we just completely disregard what our body's telling us to do at that particular time, now we're getting into overtraining. So there's a continuum of fatigue that occurs. And if we just don't listen, we're actually going to see that we're going to build up so much that we're going to need to take maybe a few days off the bike, or if it transitions more.
I'm going to stop the share there. I think everyone's kind of got the downward slope there. But it's interesting, a really interesting one for me. I mean, you mentioned some of the symptoms. So clearly we can see symptoms in just the numbers, right? I mean, there can be this period. What I see when I'm building up to peak form, I'm bringing in more and more high intensity training, whether it's 40-20 micro intervals. I might be doing variable cadence TT work, but with that really high intensity stuff, essentially what I'm then doing is often following one of those workouts with even up to 3 days of really easy training, and then after that sort of 3 days, I'll get back and I do my next HIIT training. And I'll see very quickly, so even within the first 5 or 10 minutes of doing a HIIT interval, I will see that my numbers are down by 2-3% from what I might expect. So immediately what I'll do there is just get off my bike. I'll just stop, because what that's telling me is that I'm not recovered well enough. So for me, I look to the numbers. I purely look at the numbers. If I'm not hitting the numbers I should be, then that's telling me that my body's not recovered. But you also talked about mood, because one of the things that I've noticed, when I start getting really tired, I start getting moody with people. I start shouting at my kids and stuff. That's another symptom for me to say that maybe I'm not recovering as well as I could be. What about resting heart rate? Because typically I take resting heart rate early in the morning every day. I just check what it is. And that for me is also often a good indicator. Is that effective for everyone? Is it something we should be recording and keeping track of?
I believe it is. You think about resting heart rate. We're at a resting phase. We've been hopefully sleeping 6-8 hours a night, depending upon what people are. And, you can definitely see what's going on in the morning. Probably another good thing to do if you have the opportunity. I know it's a little technology, but looking at heart rate variability is one. It kind of gives us the idea of the nervous system, how it's working. And that's really what the resting heart rate is. We can break the resting heart rate into 2 phases: a parasympathetic response, where we kind of rest, so that lowers our resting heart rate, and then we have a sympathetic response, which kind of jacks up our heart rate.
Yeah.
And if we're overtrained, that sympathetic response might be a little bit higher. But knowing what that number is, could it be 5 beats? Maybe. Could it be 10 beats? Probably. 20 beats? Yeah, we've got a problem.
Right. Yeah.
Now, getting into mood, definitely there's a psychological component. Definitely chronic fatigue sets in, so people become more moody. You might see actually maybe a little depression in some people that don't want to do things. Poor sleep habits definitely come into play, and all of these culminate together where that overtraining syndrome is definitely going to be a little bit more reactive.
Okay. So I mean, for a lot of us, I guess, and for me, I'm constantly, measuring these things like my power on the bike, is it progressing as it should be? My resting heart rate, sleep, I try to really watch that, keep a handle on that. But as I understand it, if you really do push your body too hard and you're not listening to your body, I guess partly that's psychological because you're so obsessed with training in a way. So um, for some people that I've worked with, and I mentioned Lando, my friend from last year, I think he had a bit of a problem because training became almost addictive for him. And that his belief was that if I stop, I'm going to get worse. But actually what we were seeing is that by continuing, he was getting worse. By doing more training and harder, he was getting worse. So, I mean, what's the psychological aspect here that you see and have seen with athletes who are prone to overtraining?
Probably one of the biggest, if you want to think about it, would be the old adage, no pain, no gain.
Mm.
Here, you will go to the gym, you lift weights. Well, if it doesn't hurt, it's not heavy enough, or I'm not going to make changes.
Yeah.
But the reality of it is you don't always need that pain. What you need is to adjust the system a little bit. So doing the same thing day in, day out might not always be the right answer because the body actually is a great tool. It remembers things really well.
Yeah.
And what it says is, oh, I only needed 100 muscle fibers to fire at that particular time. And now I only need 70. So I'm not going to give an overload to the system. And by doing that, we're actually going to maybe potentially cause a reduction in power. So that could also play a role in it. But if we look at the psychological effects, I mean, that's definitely something you can probably tell pretty easily. A lot of us get moody, time of day. We get a little hungry. Maybe didn't sleep well enough. The cat was, cowling in the middle of the night or jumping on your head, playing with you or whatever. But we can definitely play a big role in just observing, writing down in a training log, resting heart rate, maybe waking up in the morning, taking your body weight, seeing how much you weigh. Are you losing weight? Are you gaining weight? These are all things that definitely could play a role in determining overload or overtraining, because there's no test. We can't do a blood test. So we have to look at a lot of things to determine, are we truly overtrained? Is it a medical condition? Is it mono? Could it be chronic fatigue syndrome? Could it be something else? And all of this definitely plays a big role in that diagnosis.
Yeah. So this is where we're really starting to talk about like hormonal imbalances and stuff like that, right? So when should your alarm bells really be ringing for this sort of chronic overtraining? So, as I understand, like when I go through training periods, and I go off on a training camp to Gran Canaria and I spend 10 days there and I really do a hard 10 days, I know that it's going to take my body probably a week, 2 weeks actually, that I really need to rest and recover to see that form come, in time. So I really get that. But for some people that I've known, even after that 2 weeks, they get back and they're not seeing any improvements. They're seeing declines and the kind of symptoms you're talking about, the moodiness, the tired muscles, and so on. So once you feel that, should you go to your sports doctor? Should you get some tests done? I mean, because you said it's difficult to identify. So what is the treatment essentially when you realize that you've got into this overtrained state, that it's become chronic, it could become hormonal? What's the next steps?
Probably the biggest thing is going to be figuring out what's going on. Definitely looking at ruling out exclusions. There's a lot of other confounding variables. If you go back to 2008, Mick Rogers was, basically was scheduled to ride the whole, most of the season, and he ended up with, I believe, mono. So he was actually out. But
so can you explain mono? Can you explain mono to people?
Epstein-Barr. We call it mono here in the United States. Epstein-Barr. It's basically kind of a virus, a viral infection that actually causes, we call it the sleeping sickness.
Yeah, glandular fever, I think we call it in Australia and other places. Yeah.
So it could mimic chronic fatigue, or it could mimic the overtraining. So there's not really a blood test to determine overtraining, but we can do blood tests to determine, do you have Epstein-Barr? Do you have, unfortunately, let's say maybe potentially even a more deadlier disease, kind of like a cancer or something along those lines. We can rule out those things. but monitoring definitely plays a role. Potentially even doing a physiological test might actually give you an idea, something that you always, go out and ride. Let's say, you do a 5K or a 10K TT, and you know exactly how long it takes you, how much power you're going to generate. But if you do it and your power is lower, that could definitely potentially give you a risk. Are you sore? Definitely also talking with your partner or your training partners. They're the people that are going to know if you're, on the same level where you normally are, or are you a few steps behind.
Okay.
And that could also be a little bit indicative. And then definitely talking with your physician, definitely that will help rule out any issues potentially if it's a medical issue in that sense.
Makes a lot of sense. Cool. Okay, cool. I mean, I think this, from my experience over the last 10 years, it's been an interesting journey kind of to discover, how to reach the ceiling of performance, because this is what we're really talking about here, right? I mean, overtraining doesn't typically happen to the recreational leisure kind of rider. It's really for people who are pushing the boundaries of their performance. So for me, it actually has also been a learning journey to understand really how important, in terms of just the overreaching and the overload, how important recovery is. And as you know, with my coach, Alan Davis, he's always preaching his mantra to me that my hard days are only as good as my easy days. So that mantra is very much part of what we do. And of course, part of that is at a very practical level, recording the numbers. When it comes to overreach or overload, the power meter for us is super important, because some days it's literally getting on the bike in the morning, seeing that the numbers are not there, and then moving that training session to the evening, for example, where just that extra 8 hours of rest of your body can get you back to those numbers again. So when we talk about this overreach or overload with normal training, there's things that clearly we can do there, looking at our power numbers, tracking our resting heart rate. But I guess what we're hearing from you here is that when it starts to get to overtraining, it is very much about looking beyond some of those superficial numbers and getting much deeper, not just into the numbers, but also into the mood, into the muscle soreness, into the other aspects, and particularly the psychological aspects that we've talked about. And if you said, if you're someone who loves your cycling, but suddenly you find yourself losing motivation, losing desire to ride your bike, and that can be revealing a deeper problem. Any last words from you, Professor Josh? I mean, I hope I summarized things a little bit there, but if you were to give someone 2 or 3 pieces of advice on how to avoid overtraining, what would those be?
Probably the first and foremost, definitely think about your scaling up of your training. Don't make those big changes. Don't think about, going from, a power level of a moderate power level to a super high power level. Don't increase your volume and intensity at the same time. That definitely is going to play a role. If you have the opportunity to work with a coach, they might actually help you progress slower than what you're hoping for, but that's definitely going to reduce potentially the risk for overtraining and overreaching. And probably last and foremost would definitely be taking those times off the bike. We're allowed. It's hate to say it, it's not our job. We're not making, this isn't our career. We have other things that are important, family life, our jobs, our careers in that sense. So do put focus on those also, and realize that those also can come into play with overtraining and overreaching. So maybe getting out and doing an easy day, 2 days in a row or 3 days in a row, or just take that time off the bike completely if you need it.
Yeah. Great advice. Great advice. I think, again, from my experience, it's what I have sensed and learned working with Alan Davis. And the incredible thing for me, Professor Josh, is that, some of my best results have actually come during periods that I've considered myself to be working the least hard, particularly in terms of number of hours on the bike. Because I think the other thing that many of us don't realize, those of us who love riding our bikes, who love doing 10, 15, sometimes 20 hours a week, sometimes we actually forget or we don't realize how much fatigue our body is accruing. And when you really give your body the time to rest, to recover, sometimes you see really increased performance rather than any decrease. So I hear what you're saying there. It's important to step back from time to time to rest. And as Alan always says, your hard days are only as good as your easy days. So thanks for joining us for this episode of this Cycling Life Tech Talks. If you did like the video, please do give us the thumbs up. And of course, please do subscribe to our YouTube channel.